to welcome you once again to the Upper Room. Glad you've joined us, and you know that by now, at least, you should know that we're in a series we've been in for probably over a year called The Expression. It's a study of the book of John, and John makes no bones about the fact that Jesus not only is God himself, but he expresses who the Father is to us. And so if we want to know the Father, which in that is salvation in him, and in knowing him is salvation, then knowing Jesus is essential. Robert Benson, in his book Between Dreaming and Coming True, recounts a story about a 4-year-old little girl who whispers into her baby brother's ear, a brand new baby brother, and she says, "Baby, can you tell me what God sounds like? I'm beginning to forget." Wow, isn't that classic? And that really is the expression of what we're doing in this study and in this lesson today. In case you've forgotten what the voice of God, what understanding God is about, and it's been a while, this series and this lesson in particular will be exactly what is needed today. We're going to start with a discussion question. And that question is this: what do you believe to be one of the greatest discoveries underwater? Underwater, and I'm not talking about your little ducky in the bathtub. I'm talking about under the ocean, under the surface of the ocean, the surface of a sea. What do you think is one of the greatest discoveries that has been found? Well, underwater archaeology is one of the newer and more fascinating aspects of modern science. I mean, it seems as though they are finding things underwater every day that are just fascinating. Of course, the most famous thing that they have found, I believe, took place September 1st, 1985. And it happened just days before Christy and I were married, so I don't remember hearing about the discovery. My eyes were focused on what I'd discovered in that beautiful young lady, and have enjoyed ever since. Anyway, back to what they discovered on September 1st, 1985. They discovered the Titanic. Yeah, about 400 miles east to northeast from Newfoundland, and 13,000 feet deep at the bottom of the ocean there is where they found the Titanic. It had been 73 years since the Titanic had broken into two pieces after hitting an iceberg and sunk to the floor of the ocean. And the expeditions that have taken place since then have been enlightening. So much was left there on the bottom of the floor of the ocean that has been recovered. And in 1978, a guy by the name of Ron Wyatt discovered at the bottom of the Red Sea what he believed to be chariots and chariot wheels. And since then, many expeditions have gone to the bottom of the Red Sea, and they have discovered hundreds of skeletons as well. Gee, could you think of anything that historically might have happened at the bottom of the Red Sea? Of course, if you go to secular websites, they're going to deny that any of this has been found, but you can see video of what appear to be wheels with axles covered by now in coral. And so the question becomes, is it legitimate? Well, you and I probably don't need to know for sure if that's legitimate, but it was found, and that doesn't change anything about my understanding and conviction that what took place thousands of years ago as Moses led the people of Israel through the Red Sea, as God parted the Red Sea for them, and what happened soon thereafter to the chariots of the Egyptian army. Okay, great things are being found. Entire cities have been found. Volcanoes have been found at the bottom of the ocean. And yes, even warm, even hot streams and fountains coming from the bottom of the ocean. And that won't surprise you either when you go back and study in Genesis about the flood. Okay, I say all that to tell you that there's something spectacular about the depths to which mankind is going, but that does not even compare to the depths of what we get to explore when we come to know God. I take you to Romans 11:33, where Paul is writing, and he's quoting Isaiah 40:13, and he says this, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments and how unfathomable his ways." God's wisdom and knowledge are so deep that we will never find the bottom of his wisdom and knowledge. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16, Paul is praying for the church in Ephesus, and he says this, "I pray that from his glorious unlimited resources, he will empower you with inner strength through his Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him. Your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong." Down into the depths of his love. That's what he means. Verse 18, "And may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep is his love." The depths of his love. May you explore the depths of God's love, he says. Then he writes to the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 10. "For it was to us that God revealed these things by his Spirit. For his Spirit searches out everything and shows us God's deep secrets." The same Spirit that lives in you and lives in me searches the deep secrets of God. And the word there for deep is buthos, and it literally refers usually to the depths of the ocean, the depths of the sea. But when you get to the depths of God, you'll find secrets, and you'll find his love and his knowledge and his wisdom. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, Paul writes, "3 times I was beaten with rods. 1 time I was almost stoned to death. 3 times I was in ships that wrecked. And one of those times I spent a night and a day in the sea." The word for sea there is buthos, the deep. I spent a night and a day in the deep. The depths of God are somewhat like the depths of the oceans and the seas, except you'll never get to the very bottom of God's love or his wisdom or knowledge or his secrets, which brings us to the passage we're going to study today in John chapter 11. What we're about to study would be easily written off as insignificant and just stage setting for something much more important, but we're not going to blow by it like that. That's why we are at this location. We are at the base of the San Juan Mountains. I mean, I'm staring right up at these giant peaks of the Rocky Mountains. They're right in front of me. But behind me is an old, abandoned, one-room cabin. And it's been something we have driven by many times, and to my knowledge, we've never seen anybody there. We've never seen anybody walking around down there. Nobody lives there anymore. It's really easy to drive right by it and not even notice. And that's what we tend to do with some passages of Scripture. But let me tell you, if we cared enough to actually dig into that cabin, I don't mean break into it, but study the history of that cabin, when it was built, who lived there, I would bet that we would find that maybe a family lived there. Maybe children were born in that one-room cabin. There's not a hospital for a good 30 miles to my knowledge. So maybe children were born there. Maybe there was a lot of laughter. I'll bet there was some heartache. There were some dark, cold times. I don't know if they always had enough firewood to keep warm up at this elevation. But what I do know is that there is more than meets the eye when you glance at that cabin. I'll bet some real special things happened. Maybe some secrets are kept that took place in that cabin. But that cabin, as I thought about it, because we've driven by it many times, reminds me of this passage. At first glance, it's something you just glance at, and you move on to the more significant things. And down this road are more significant homes and things that would interest us much more than that lone, empty cabin. This is simply an amazing time in the life of Jesus. As we said in the last lesson, the end of chapter 10 of John ends his public ministry as far as his teaching. But we're in chapter 11 now, and this is a narrative. This is a story. Let me tell you what's going to be challenging about this passage. One of the things that's challenging, again, it's something we might just drive on by very easily, but you and I live and have lived for decades with special effects, with technology, what they call CGI, right? Computer generated images. And it really lends itself to us getting used to looking at things that are not real, all right? Very little in movies, as we've mentioned before, maybe even TV shows, is actually real. And so it'd be easy as we get into this chapter 11 of John to go, right, that's probably not real. How could that possibly be real? Well, as you know by now, John chapter 11, you've probably read it many times, is going to be the story or the historical event of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So it's so tempting to buzz by the first 16 verses and get to that unbelievable moment. Lazarus has been in the grave 4 days, so there's no mistaking the fact that he was truly dead. And Jesus raises him from the dead, and then what results is what needs to take place in order for Jesus to be then, in the next week or so of his life, put on a cross. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We want to slow down and look at this cabin. I really do wonder what took place in this cabin over the last maybe 100 years. Let's slow down and get into these first 16 verses. We'll begin by setting the stage, or rather John begins by setting the backdrop and the stage for this amazing event. So we go to chapter 11, verse 1. A man named Lazarus, John writes, was sick. You're about to find out he was not just sick, he was near death at this moment. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. He will describe that event in chapter 12. What's interesting is that 2 of the other Gospels have already described this event of Mary wiping the Lord's feet with her hair. And because those Gospels were written long before this Gospel, the story has been out there in circulation for maybe 20, 30 years. And so John will not go into detail, especially here, but that's the Mary he's talking about. The reason he has to differentiate is because Mary was a very common name. You get to the cross and there's Marys everywhere. You have Mary, the mother of Jesus, and you have several other Marys. The word Mary is an offshoot of Miriam, and that takes you all the way back to the story of Moses. And so he has to explain which Mary this is. Her brother Lazarus was sick. Verse 3. So the 2 sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend whom you love is very sick. Okay, let's break that up a little bit, unpack it a little bit to make sure you're fully understanding what's going on. Lazarus, the Hebrew name for Lazarus, again, Lazarus was a pretty common name. Now this Lazarus is not the same Lazarus that Jesus spoke of in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, but it was a common name. The Hebrew derivative of this is Eliezer. And Eliezer, this is awesome, means the one whom God helps. God's about to really help him, all right? That's who Lazarus is here. Remember, Jesus, at the end of chapter 10, left Jerusalem and went across the Jordan to where John was baptizing. Interestingly, if you go back to when John was baptizing and teaching and preaching, there's a town there called Bethany. This is a different Bethany here. This is on the east side of Jerusalem, from the east wall, just 2 miles. Just a tiny little village. The word Bethany means house of the poor. So it was a small, poor village that Lazarus and his 2 sisters lived in. And I guarantee you, I can give you some passages, Matthew 21:17, Mark 11:11, that Jesus and his friends, his disciples, stayed there often. In fact, Mary and Martha and Lazarus' house might have been Jesus' Motel 6 for he and his disciples. for every time they went to Jerusalem. We're not sure about that, but they were friends, and that's what we find out here in verse 11. Down in the passage at verse 11, Jesus will say to the disciples, "Our friend." When Mary and Martha send this messenger with this message that their brother is sick, and by the way, that would take him a day to get where Jesus actually is. But when they send that message, the message includes, the friend you love is sick. The word love there is really interesting. It's not agape, the God's selfless sacrificial love, but it's phileo, the word for a friend's love. In other words, the message contained your friend, Jesus. And as I just said, Jesus said to his other disciples, our friend Lazarus. Isn't it interesting that Jesus, we talk about his humanity sometimes, and he did need to eat and drink, and he got tired and all of that. One of the things we seldom talk about is his need for friends. Really. I mean, you think of the Son of God maybe not needing friends, but he valued this friendship, and we'll see that as this story unfolds. I don't know about you, but what that tells me is that Jesus valued human relationships, and human relationships are essential to all of us. We can't live without them. So that's the backdrop. All right, so here we go. We're going to look at the depths of some secretive things. As this event unfolds, there are some things we cannot breeze by like we used to breeze by this cavern. And the first one is the depth of death. All right? And that prompts another discussion question. And so the second discussion question is this: how do you deal with death? Verse 4 begins this way, "But when Jesus heard about it, he said, 'Lazarus' sickness will not end in death.'" Now that may seem pretty nonchalant and uncaring on Jesus' part, but we know he loved Lazarus. There is something else going on here when he says it will not end in death. And if you know the story, you say, but he did die. But you also know it doesn't end in death. Great stuff. So Jesus goes on and he says this: "No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this." That's packed with meaning we'll get to in the next lesson. Verse 5, "So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days." This is how we know that when he does get back to Bethany, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. It took a day for the messenger to get to him. He stays 2 days, and then he will return. As you know, that'll take a day. 4 days in the grave is what we're talking about with Lazarus. Verse 11, let's jump to that. We're going to skip a couple verses, come back to them. Verse 11, "Then he said, 'Our friend,'" there it is, "'our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up.'" We're going to get into that word, fall asleep. It's really important to understand the depths of what Jesus is saying about death. Verse 12, "The disciples said, 'Lord, if he is sleeping, he'll soon get better,'" right? We heard he was sick, and the best thing to do when someone's sick is to get a lot of rest. So he'll be fine. Now, why are they not wanting to go back? We're about to find out. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead." Okay? He feels like he has to do that because they are lost. The word sleeping, when he says he is just asleep, the word there is koimeo, and it's really a significant word. It means to lay down, settle in, rest, but it has to do with positioning. The position he's in is a position of rest, which would bring on sleep. The use of this word in the New Testament has two implications to it. Number one, it is a physical placement. And number two, it has to do with divine purpose. Isn't that interesting? Not just, yeah, he's at a place of rest, but this is divinely orchestrated. Let me give you some examples of that. Philippians chapter 1, verse 15, Paul writes, "It's true that some are preaching out of jealousy and rivalry, but others preach about Christ with pure motives. They preach because they love me, for they know I have been appointed to defend the good news. Koimeo is the word there, appointed. It is God's will that I'm in this position to preach the good news. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 1. We decided to stay alone in Athens, and we sent Timothy to visit you. He is our brother and God's co-worker in proclaiming the good news of Christ. We sent him to strengthen you, to encourage you in your faith, and to keep you from being shaken by the troubles you were going through. But you know that we are destined for such troubles. The word destined there is koimeo, the same word that Jesus used when he said he's sleeping. It's as though Jesus is saying it has been divinely arranged that Lazarus lie down and not be awake, actually. So what can we learn from the concept of sleeping even today? Well, number one, what we just talked about. It's divinely orchestrated. In this situation, it is divinely orchestrated. As you know by now, you may not sleep enough, but it has been divinely appointed that we do sleep, that we do recline. And so it's divinely assigned. And secondly, we know that sleep is temporary. That is huge, right? Nobody just falls asleep forever, unless you're in a fairy tale like Rip Van Winkle, but it is divinely orchestrated and it is temporary. So when Jesus speaks of sleep, he's saying those two things, and yet his disciples say, well, then if he's sleeping, he's fine. Let's not go back. And then he has to say, okay, you don't get it. I'll just tell you plainly, he's dead. He died. So the theme of death is in Scripture, of course, it's all throughout life. That's why I want you to talk about how you deal with it. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6, so we are always confident, even though we know that as long as we live in these bodies, we are not at home with the Lord. As long as I'm in this body, and I am in this body is not me. Thank you, Lord. As long as I'm in here, I'm not with him. He goes on, for we live by believing and not by seeing. We live by trust and confidence in what we don't see. Yes, we are fully confident, and we would rather be away from these earthly bodies. Amen. Can I get an amen? For then we would be home with the Lord. To be in the body is to be away from the Lord. To be out of this body is to be with the Lord. There is no time lapse there. Paul does not say, and you'll wait a few thousand years or 100 years or sometime, and then you'll be with the Lord. No, to be out of this body, which I plan on getting out of this body, hopefully, in the next 20, 30 years, you're with the Lord. Okay, that's really important. So the depths of understanding of death comes from Jesus in this moment, in this time, and it gives us great clues into one of the things we fear the most, right? And need not fear if we go to the depths of what this means according to Jesus. And that brings us to the second depth that we see, and it is the depth of danger. All right, sometimes danger and death we connect. Look at verse 7. Back to verse 7. Finally, he said to his disciples, after 2 days, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. Okay, let's cross back across the river into Judea. Back, I want to go see Lazarus. I want to go check in with Mary, Martha, and we know he'll really check in with Lazarus. But in verse 8, it says, but his disciples said to him, Rabbi, only a few days ago the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again? Now, before we start calling the disciples names like, wimps and wusses, you need to understand their fear was legit. Several times, 4 in the book of John that we know of, Jesus was close to being murdered. And they're with Jesus. So that would probably include them in the process. They are truly concerned. And they don't have the hindsight that you and I have. In hindsight, we look back and go, what are you so upset about? This all works out well. It's all fine. They didn't know that. So they're saying, are you kidding me, Jesus? Are you serious right now? You can go right back to where they were trying to kill you? Why would we do that? And besides, we've seen you heal people from a distance. If you want to heal Lazarus, just heal him from a distance. And, we'll just go on doing what we're enjoying doing here. We're having a good ministry here. Everybody like hanging out with you. Why would we walk back into danger? Well, there's some important things about danger and risk that Jesus is going to point out by saying, we're going. We're not going to be afraid. And Jesus is about to tell them why danger cannot be a motivating factor, why fear of danger, fear of risk, cannot be a motivating factor for how we live. Listen to this in verse 9. Jesus replied to them, "There are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there is danger of stumbling because they have no light." What is he talking about? I mean, we're talking about a friend who died, and do we have to go back, and what's going on? And he shares this little known proverb, and it is a proverb. And it's about the fact that I get it. In the daylight, there is little danger, right? We seldom are afraid in the daylight. It's at night that we become fearful. The point of the proverb, and this is so fascinating to me, this is where part of the depths that we're going to with Jesus. What he's saying is you can't change the length of a day. You can't lengthen it. You can't shorten it. What's that have to do with him? The implication, the inference is, and my life will not be shortened by any circumstance. It is in my Father's hands. My life will last as long as he wants it to last. And we know that from the times he escaped being executed because it wasn't the right time. The time had not come. The time is about to come. But think about the implications for us. That's how Jesus lived. There is nothing to fear because just like you can't lengthen the day or shorten the day, you can't lengthen my life or shorten my life. Nobody can lengthen or shorten my life. My days are numbered. The Father has the number of my days written down, and when that time comes, then it comes, and I get to be back with him. But in between then and now, there is nothing, absolutely nothing to fear. Isn't that fascinating how he uses that proverb to teach them, why are you afraid to go back? Don't be afraid. The Father's timing is perfect, and, you have nothing to worry about. Now, if you grew up in a home and an environment like I did, where safety was an obsession, we do the safe thing. Most of us grow up that way. Let's do the safe thing. Then this is a tough pill to swallow. This idea that really you're untouchable until the Father says your time is up. Is that really possible? Dan Taylor, in his book, The Myth of Certainty, puts it this way. Risk is indispensable to any significant life. Nowhere more clearly seen than in the life of the Spirit. The goal of life is not to create a set of immutable, that means unchangeable, immutable, rationalized, precisely defined, and defendable beliefs to preserve forever. Do you get that? Our goal is not to come up with a set of beliefs that this will never change and we'll stick to this belief no matter what about life in general. Now, belief and trust in Christ is different. He says we try to preserve our beliefs about life forever. He says we should not do that. And then he goes on and finishes this way. The purpose of life is to recover a relationship with God. Whatever that takes, whatever it takes for me to trust him more, to trust that he has my days numbered and his will is perfect, that's a relationship with God. That's our goal, not to preserve our lives. So those of us who grew up with a safety obsession lifestyle need to rethink that. Now, most of us are fully aware that in the face of danger, we will either fight or flight, right? That's going to be our response, to fight or flight, to run away. And most of us, if we're obsessed with safety, in a minute we'll talk about security, then flight is the option we often take. I've mentioned before we took a group of high school and college kids to Ukraine, and they took us, after a few days there, they took us to what was going to be a camp with kids, okay? And so we got in this bus, and it drove us 2 or 3 hours outside the city of Kherson, Ukraine, and we came to this open area, and it really was a wilderness. There was nothing out there at all. There hadn't been anything for at least an hour. And so we're out in the middle of nowhere, and I see a bunch of tents pitched. That's where we would stay, in these tents. And we were dropped off. I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but literally as that bus drove away, and I'm leading this trip, by the way, as that bus drove away, it took everything within me to not run after that bus. I literally thought about it, running after the bus and saying, stop, 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 let us get back on. We're not staying out here. I guess it was God's Spirit that said, shut your mouth. Just trust me in this. All of us would team up with Ukrainian people in these tents. There are only 2 men or 2 women tents. I guess it was God's will that I got to spend the next 5 or 6 days with a guy that was KGB all his life. And he was serious business. Not a lot of smiling going on. Spoke Russian or Ukrainian to me all the time. I just did what he told me to do as far as showing me, and it was push-ups in the morning, sit-ups at night. But I tell you, my temptation, my tendency was to run from that. I'm so glad I didn't. In fact, over the years, we have taken kids and families to, whether it was Ukraine or Mexico, to build houses, work in orphanages, or the inner cities of Washington, D.C., and L.A., and Seattle, San Francisco, San Jose, Denver, all of those things. We've taken our kids to Haiti and to the Dominican Republic. And I'll be honest with you, each of those ventures included risk, sometimes huge risk. But I am so glad that none of us backed down from those opportunities that were risky, that seemed kind of dangerous, to be honest with you, because the memories we have are unbelievable and we carry them with us our whole lives. And it makes me wonder, what would we all miss out on if we ran from danger? Like these disciples would rather run away from danger that was right in their face. As I mentioned, many of us are safety obsessed. Some of us are security obsessed, right? We're not going to do anything that risks what we own, what we have, the money we have. Mike Yaconelli, in his wonderful book, Dangerous Wonder, says this: Jesus called his disciples to a very odd standard of living. Nothing. When our possessions possess us, they imprison us. Risk and adventure become impossible. Is it possible that we are owned by our possessions? And so risk is impossible for us. You might remember that in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23, Paul is actually defending himself. He's coming under attack and accusations. And so he writes about his resume as to what he has done on behalf of the Lord. He says, I have been put in prison. I've been whipped times without number, faced death again and again. 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes, right? 39 instead of 40, because 40 was the law and they didn't want a chance going past the law and doing something evil. Sin that way, but we can beat him up. 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and a day at sea. Remember we talked about that earlier, in the deep. He was actually in the deep. I don't know if he floated around in the ocean. Crazy stuff. I have traveled on many long journeys. I have faced danger from rivers and from robbers. I have faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I have faced danger in the cities, in the deserts, and on the seas. And I have faced danger from men who claim to be believers but are not. I have worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty and have gone without food. I have shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. Then, besides all that, it's a pretty good list, right? About risk and danger. I have the daily burden of the concern for all the churches. The word is ecclesia, that is assemblies or gatherings, not buildings. I have a daily concern, and I get that, a daily concern for you all. Who is weak without my feeling that weakness? What a great example Paul is of saying, you know, when my time's up, my time's up. Until then, it is all out. I'll do whatever God leads me to do. Discussion question: how do you deal with danger? If we take danger out of the equation of kingdom living, then we will lose the surprise and wonder of it all. You can be sure that whatever lies ahead, God is already there waiting. Isn't that great news? The truth is, the modern church has tempered us. We no longer look for, expect to do dangerous things on behalf of God, do we? A.W. Tozer put it this way: culture is putting out the light in men and women's souls. I would add church culture. The culture does that, but the church culture does that. Puts out the light in men and women's souls. We have this burning desire when the Holy Spirit enters us to do whatever it is that God leads us to do, no matter what the risk or the danger. But the modern church tends to put that light out, kind of frowns upon that kind of a wild lifestyle. And I'm not talking wild in a sinful way, but in an adventurous way. And these disciples turned to Jesus and said, what in the world are you thinking? Why would you ever want to go back there? So when it comes to the message in the modern church, as one author put it, good news is no longer good news, it's okay news. Christianity is no longer life-changing, it's life-enhancing. Jesus doesn't change people into wild-eyed radicals anymore. He changes them into nice people. And if all this is about is being a nice person, count me out. And that leads us to our next depth that we're going to notice in this passage, and it's the depth of dependence in verse 15. After they say to him, we don't want to go, I don't want to die. Jesus, we don't want you to die. Jesus says, for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there. For now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. For your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there to see and heal Lazarus, because now you're going to have the opportunity to see something you would never have seen, would never have believed to be true unless you saw it with your own eyes. Of course, again, the word believe is pisteuo or pistos, which means you're going to have greater confidence in me. You're going to have greater trust and reliance in me if you'll join me as we go back to Bethany. You might remember that in Matthew chapter 8, a Roman officer, actually a centurion, so he was an officer in charge of 100 soldiers, came to Jesus and said, I have a servant who's dying, and I've heard you heal people. Would you heal him? And he says, you don't even have to come to my house because I get it. You're in charge. I'm in charge of people. All you have to do is say the word. It'll be done. And Jesus responds to that incredible approach by this pagan, totally pagan guy, non-Jew. He responds this way in verse 10 of Matthew 8. I tell you the truth, I haven't seen such faith, pistos, confidence, sureness like this in all of Israel. And I tell you this, that many Gentiles will come from all over the world, from east and west, and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the feast in the kingdom of heaven. But many Israelites, those for whom the kingdom was prepared, will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus, seriously? Gentiles will come and be a part of the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but Israelites will be thrown out? Why? Because they don't trust me. They don't place their confidence in me. They don't rely upon me. They're not sure about me. That's why he said, I've not seen this kind of confidence in me from any of y'all. Then we go to Mark chapter 9, verse 17. One of the men in the crowd spoke up and said, Teacher, I brought my son to you so you could heal him. He's possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whenever the spirit seizes him, it throws him violently into the ground. Then he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it. This father is just panicked, right? Wouldn't you be if your child was filled with an evil spirit? And Jesus responds, you faithless people, you people who do not have any confidence in God's power. How long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. Oh man, I'd hate to be one of the disciples on that day. As Jesus looks at them and says, you have no confidence in the power of God. Give me the kid. This is ridiculous. So they brought the boy. When the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. How long has this been going on? Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can. Jesus responds, what do you mean, if I can? See, even this father is just hoping, but there's no confidence, there's no sureness. And Jesus' response is so classic. What do you mean? You think I lack confidence? You think I lack reliance and trust in the Father? Anything is possible if a person believes. And that's what this is about. It's about putting our confidence in him again. And then the Father instantly cried out. You've heard this phrase before. It's beautiful because it helps us understand the concept of believing. He says, I do believe, but help my unbelief. What does that tell us? That confidence in Jesus, that reliance and trust in him is not a all in or all out. It is a process. It is a journey. And we have some confidence, but then we lack confidence and we waver. As long as we're on the journey of confidence in him and trust in him, I think he's great with us following him that way. But if we say, I'm never going to trust him with my life, I'm never going to trust him to make the difference that needs to be made, that's when we find ourselves in that place of being faithless. And so now we come to the last depth of this seemingly unimportant passage, but now you can see how vital it is. And we find it in verse 16, the depth of dedication. Thomas, nicknamed the twin, your translation may say Didymus, which means twin, means he had a twin, said to the rest of the disciples, let's go to and die with him. Now, Thomas is known for doubting, right? He'll doubt later until Jesus shows him his hands and his feet that have been pierced. And then he says so profoundly, my Lord and my God. In this moment, however, he is full on dedicated. It kind of sounds like a downer. Okay, well, if we're going to go and die, let's go and die. But I think he is saying, I'm all in. You know, let's go. Jesus wants us to go. Let's go. If we're going to die, we're going to die. He's getting that proverb, I think, that Jesus told them just a few seconds earlier. And so Thomas is all in. Or is he? In Matthew 26, Jesus is being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And of course, Thomas is there. Peter is there. The rest of the disciples are there. In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, verse 55, am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple and courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. He can say that with a smile on his face because he knows it was my Father's timing. It was my Father's will at that point. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. No dying with Jesus. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance. We don't know a lot about Thomas. It's kind of vague after this episode. We look to tradition, and tradition tells us that after the resurrection of Jesus, he moved east into India. And tradition tells us he started many churches there, and tradition tells us that he died a martyr's death. And so the dedication, the commitment of Thomas, it was there for a moment, and then he slipped away from that commitment to Jesus, but he returned. The commitment to put ourselves aside is what we're talking about here, and the depths of that commitment are truly significant if indeed we make that commitment. Matthew chapter 10, verse 38. Jesus said, if you refuse to take up your cross and follow me, you are not worthy of being mine. Taking up the cross is a commitment. Luke chapter 9, verse 23. Then he said to the crowd, if any of you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Did you get that? Have you done that? I want to follow Jesus. I just don't want to give up my own way. Take up your cross daily and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. Romans chapter 6, verse 6, we know that our old sinful selves were crucified with Christ so that sin might lose its power in our lives. We are no longer slaves to sin. That's the old life. I no longer follow the sinful nature that was once in me. Romans 12, 1 and 2, of course, I plead with you to give your bodies to God. Your body, my body, does not belong to you, does not belong to me. Because of all he has done for you, let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. Don't copy the behavior and customs of the world. What are the behaviors and customs of the world? I worship my own body. I take care of myself. It's my body, and I can do as I please. That's the custom of this world. Don't follow that. Don't live that way. Galatians 2:20. My old self has been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting, pistos, in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. So as you can see, much like this cabin behind us, it could be easily overlooked, this part of the passage. We want to jump to the raising of Lazarus and how exciting that is and all the details about that. But man, to do that is to miss the depths of what Jesus teaches, not just in his teaching, but this is what amazed me about this passage. Just in his interactions, right? In his interactions with people, there's such depth. Now, what keeps us from living at that depth? An old farmer was once asked why his cows sometimes get out on the road. And his answer was classic. He said, a cow is nibbling on a tuft of grass in the middle of a field, moving from one tuft to the next, and before you know it, he ends up at some grass next to the fence. Noticing a nice clump of grass on the other side of the fence, the cow stumbles through an old tear in the fence and finds himself outside of the road. And then he says this. This is great. Cows don't intend to get lost. They just nibble their way to lostness. How did we get to this place of being focused on ourselves and obsessed with safety and security and filled with anxieties and fears and becoming self-reliant? How did we get here? I mean, we started on this path with Jesus, and it was exciting and challenging and risky at times. Have we nibbled ourselves into lostness? Have we just gotten lost in this place of I'll take care of myself and I won't take any risks? And I don't want to really live that deep. Have we become satisfied with shallow living? If I fear death, and if I fear danger, and if I cannot be dependent on Jesus and the Father, and if I am unwilling to make a commitment to putting myself aside, I fear that I've lost my way. I want to end with this quote from Richard Foster in 1978. He put it this way: superficiality is the curse of our age. The doctrine of instant satisfaction is a primary spiritual problem. The desperate need today is not for a greater number of intelligent people or gifted people, but for deep people. That's still true. That was back in 1978. In 2024, there's still a need for people of depth who take the words of Jesus, the interactions that Jesus has, and says, wow, that's what's waiting for me. The depths of his knowledge and wisdom, the depths of his love, that's what awaits me. That's what awaits you and what awaits me. My concern again is that just like we have driven by this old abandoned cabin so many times and never really cared, just kind of noticed it, that may be how we are looking at God's word. We zoom past these passages that aren't as interesting as the exciting ones, and we don't stop long enough to investigate, what is this really about? It's about the depths of God and the depths that he invites us into. It's so great to be with you. Thanks again for joining us, and pray that God will bless your journey. And we love doing that journey with you. God bless you guys.